We're live. Good evening, everyone.
G'day. How you going?
Hello there.
Hello there. We're coming to you live from...
Well, where are we?
Not really sunny anymore, is it?
No.
They call us the Sunshine State.
No, it's not.
Look at that outside. What's that? That's not sunshine.
It's not. It's not. You know.
It's not sunshine, it's synthwave.
Right.
We are, after all, the Synthwave Party.
Right. I'm Brandon Selic. I'm the lead Senate candidate for the Pirate Party in Queensland. This is
Miles Whiticker, number 2 on the ticket.
so we are doing a Q&A just before the election, after the paid advertisement blackout has begun, because this isn't a paid advertisement, so we're allowed to do this. Also, The legislation hasn't caught up with social media posting, which is why you will probably still see certain parties' YouTube ads if you don't have a good ad blocker while watching YouTube, or subscribe to YouTube Red.
You know what? We've got an idea. We've got a few thoughts about that, haven't we?
We do.
What about, here's one thought. How about getting a party elected and candidates elected who actually understand technology? Is that too much to ask?
Well, I hope not.
Well, that's the question for our audience tonight. That's the question for voters on Saturday.
And we'll find out soon enough in regards to that. But yes, we would definitely be looking to change the advertising rules to bring them into the 21st century, so we can prevent annoying ads after the media blackout when you just want to watch Cobra Kai season 3 on YouTube and not be blasted by Trump light politics with an Australian bent.
Yeah, so how many wannabe Trumps do we have in Queensland now? Are we up to 4 yet? Are we still on 3?
Just the one. The others
Just
aren't.
the one?
The others aren't.
Pretty sure Pauline Hanson was trying for a while. Let's get real. No?
No. She's her own thing.
So obviously we're talking about Clive Palmer here. He's got the suit, he's got the hair, he's got the attitude.
He's got the hat.
He's got the hat.
One other thing we can talk about while we're waiting is a question we've been getting quite often in regards to 18C of the racial...
This is a very recent one that's just recently popped up.
Of the Racial Discrimination Act, because there was a piece a couple of days ago in The Guardian that put that front and centre in regards to our policies, which is not the case. If you look at our policies on pirateparty.org.au/wiki/platform, I think it is. No, platform.pirateparty.org.au. I'm more old school in how I send out my URLs. So yeah, it does say, we have to clarify. 18C, we were looking at that. It was my view at the time that after it was drafted, and it was the party's view as well now, that 18C and 18D of the Racial Discrimination Act, which is what certain commentators came under trouble for in regards to comments they made in the media, we were of the view that the 18C and the 18D protections were needed until a National Bill of Rights can be put into law. At that point, certain legislation may be redundant. I'm very much for, if you don't need certain bits of legislation anymore, get rid of them. But if they're still needed, absolutely keep them. At the time the policy was drafted, we were supporting a repeal of 18C only if the existing protections against discrimination were found to be adequate. I think there's a good case that they're not. 18C and D should stay.
And we know from large segments of the LGBTIQ community that they believe quite strongly that protections outside of 18C and 18D are inadequate.
Absolutely. And just because everyone watches way too much American TV, here we have to say it again. You do not have a right to free speech in Australia. You have protection. You have a right to free press, and you have a right to political expression, which is why you're allowed in certain states in all states in Australia to walk down the road and say disparaging things loudly about certain politicians without receiving any punishment. But there are protections for certain classes and groups under the legislation: protection from hate speech, protection from vilification.
What we need is a Human Rights Act to unify all this legislation.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Brandon, let's just wind back a second, because this is a debate about what is a large part of Australia, let's be honest, fairly obscure legislation. Let's just quickly define that. So Section 18C is referring to part of the Racial Discrimination Act 1975.
Which is a Commonwealth Act.
So federal government, right at the top. Section 18C deals with offensive behaviour because of race, colour, national or ethnic origin in Australia. So it was passed by the Whitlam government, and it makes racial discrimination unlawful in Australia. So Section 18D is the qualifier. 18D says that anything done reasonably or in good faith in the performance of art or in the course of academic, artistic, scientific endeavor in the public interest, or in publishing a fair and accurate recounting in the public interest or fair comment in a matter of public interest, blah, 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 are accepted from 18C, basically.
Mm. Yeah, 18C was put in there during the Keating government, as I recall, and it's stayed there ever since, and until they make some changes. Yeah. Okay. We want to... Yeah, we have a question here. All right.
Hey, David, how you going? So that's a totally fair and valid question. So the simple answer is we don't control our preferences. That's up to the party. That's up to, so we put all our preference out to vote to all party members. And what we've done is, from memory, the Liberal Democrats came in around number 8 or number 12.
That sounds about
overall,
right.
nationally.
Yeah.
So this did put them a little bit far down, but I believe Liberal Democrats are on our how to vote cards in one state, might be South Australia. Possibly. I'm just double checking that now. So obviously we do have a lot of overlap with the Liberal Democrats.
The main areas we disagree with the Liberal Democrats are essentially gun legislation and tax policy.
That's right. That said,
Yeah.
the Liberal Democrats do actually like our tax policy.
Yes. We get along quite well with them.
It has been described, and I quote, less shit than all the other parties, which is high praise.
Yeah, and we get along with them a lot better since certain politicians aren't in the party anymore, I'll be honest.
So to quickly sort of summarize on that, our stance on guns in opposition to the LDP, our stance is to maintain the current gun control legislation.
Yes, the engineer's maximum. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Our gun laws work.
Yeah.
So let's keep them.
Yeah, that's right. So the quick caveat there is that obviously we're looking at certain exceptions to that. So there's problems in New South Wales and to a lesser extent here in Queensland, Victoria, to do with regulation and legislation of toy firearms.
Yeah.
So things like gel blasters and paintball markers.
Things that aren't firearms.
Things that are harmless, or comparatively harmless. And that should be allowed recreationally. And there's very little reason to...
used sensibly.
Of course.
So not carried in public places, brightly coloured, or if not brightly coloured, having at least the orange tip. So it is clear that it is not a real firearm.
Yeah, so that said, we're not anti-gun.
No.
We're just pro-gun control.
No, absolutely. Just sensible gun ownership and regulation.
I know Brandon goes shooting.
Occasionally. Pistol
yeah.
shooting, rifle shooting. Also use a bow and arrow.
I've got a gel marker at home. A lot of fun. Very fun.
Yeah. Paintball's a fun sport. Yeah.
All right.
The backup question was, are you about plundering in political relationships?
Not at all. No. So in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do is bring in some honesty to Australian politics and transparency. So we believe very strongly in direct democracy, and we believe strongly in passing on responsibilities to the party and to an extent the people of Australia over what we as individuals may decide as elected representatives.
There has to be accountability. Also, hello, William from Norway.
There's some very interesting things happening in Europe at the moment. Some very exciting things. I know my Twitter is blown up with posts in French.
Yeah, I need to learn my European language again.
I'm in fact learning French at the moment.
I keep hitting the translate button.
J'apprends parler français.
Je ne parle pas français. Vous parlez anglais.
Oui, oui.
About as far
Bien.
as I go.
What are our views on a big Australia? Well, that would be referring to our immigration policy.
Yes, which, okay, let's be honest, we don't have an immigration policy.
Actually, we do.
We do?
So our immigration policy is...
our immigration policy is framed completely in the context of refugee and asylum seekers, essentially. So we do have an immigration policy,
so
just framed that way.
Seeking asylum is a human right, one recognized by the UN and by all signatories to the UN, that everyone has a right to flee from political persecution or persecution, oppression on various other grounds. And that is a right that should be observed and respected by all of humankind. So we support that. Now, regarding migrants or immigration, our policy deals with setting up what we refer to as a regional processing queue. So for a start, we support onshore detention, and where necessary, only where necessary, and we also support integration into Australian society. But with a regional processing queue, what that would involve is we partner with other countries around the Southeast Asia and Oceania region, such as Indonesia, our close partners, Malaysia, Thailand, China, Japan, etc. And then, according to the capacity of each country to intake refugees, we would all agree to take a portion of it. So obviously, we would need to take a strong stance on regional geopolitics. We would need to be a regional leader, and we would need to be demonstrating to the world it's an ambitious policy, but it might be what's needed.
And that's where foreign policy comes into it. Australia has been failing quite significantly in regards to foreign policy, not just with old allies, but also just in the local region, particularly Southeast Asia. If we're going to assist and become a world leader in regards to immigration and refugee and asylum seekers, we need to shore things up with our closest neighbours first in regards to a diplomatic sense. And then we can start looking at the UN centres in regards to refugee processing and assist with that. And once that has been settled, hopefully, we can start looking further afield as well into what's causing the high amount of refugees and asylum seekers being sent to this part of the world, and what we can do to help them. But again, it comes down to foreign policy, which we just have been abysmal at for the last 6 to 12 years.
There's been a very major failure of foreign policy in Australia recently to do with the ongoing Assange saga. This is a sore spot in terms of our foreign policy, that Australia has not, as a government, and to an extent a nation, has not taken a stance on Assange and Manning and Snowden, has not done anything to offer protections to Assange or any attempt to put diplomatic leverage on the UK, the US, Sweden, and Ecuador where necessary to make sure that not only does Assange receive due process and his rights are respected as an Australian citizen.
Which is strange, considering when we appeared at the Free Assange rally at the beginning of May, so a couple of weeks back now, while I was doing research for my speech for that, we found out that the Australian government had actually issued Assange with a new Australian passport back in February. So they're willing to do that, but they're not willing to go further to protect the citizen, which is just strange to us. He should be afforded the rights of an Australian citizen. He should be receiving the full protections of our Department of Foreign Affairs to try and deal with these ridiculous charges emanating from the US and bring him home.
So we don't even know what the US wants to charge him from. We found the sealed indictment.
The sealed indictment showed it was I can't remember what was the charge. It was under the incitement to leak state data, or it was
encouragement to leak state data or something.
It's under one of their I can't remember the name of the act of it. It's only one charge at the moment. The charge carries a head
Espionage Act or something.
Carries a head sentence of 5 years. So that's what he's looking at the moment. But of course, they may expand that. Fortunately, the good news in that was, while that hasn't happened yet, Chelsea Manning has been released from custody in the US. She may be facing another grand jury at the moment, but she is out of custody, which is good news at least, and a positive development in this case.
Chelsea Manning, who received several hundred kilograms of support letters, paper support letters over the last 10 years, which is probably a Guinness World Record.
Yes. Yeah. All right, so we have another question here from Matthew. Matthew, so what are our views on drug legalization?
We've got many and varied and fascinating stances on that. In fact, here, just south over the border, is the marijuana capital of Australia. We're talking, of course, about Nimbin, the location of the Hemp Embassy, and Mardi Gras, the yearly festival. It's a fantastic time for anyone who can make it down. And for us here in Brisbane, it's only a couple of hours south over the border, so we get a lot of Queenslanders heading down for it.
Our basic stance on drug legalization is we're going to legalise cannabis first, and then we'll come for the rest of them. But we're going to do it in a responsible and rolled-out fashion. We understand that these are substances like alcohol and tobacco that need to be regulated, but also
sometimes safer than alcohol.
Sometimes safer. Cannabis, particularly, a lot of the research shows that it is safer than alcohol and tobacco. So it has to be legalised, and it has to be regulated, and then it can be taxed for revenue for the state. So you can then So you can, like Colorado is the model I love looking at particularly because they've done wonderful things in regards to their state taxation revenue.
So how many millions in state revenue are we looking at here?
No, I've got no idea.
Several tens of millions, I think it was, more.
Probably, but also I've worked as a defense lawyer. My first big case 10 years ago was a ridiculous marijuana growing case where the gentleman in question was growing plants for his own use because he had genetic disorder which caused him chronic pain issues. So his doctor who had been retiring at the time and said to him, "Look, just smoke weed, man. That'll help you with the pain." And I wish I had kept audio of the police raid on this guy's house because it's one of the most hilarious audio files I've ever heard. Because he's just like, "Yeah, come in. Here are my drugs. I'll show you my drugs are. This is my mum. Mum, this is the police. I'm going to show the police what the drugs are." And yeah, we managed to get him off with no conviction recorded and a $700 fine, which was very good. But now, because of mandatory sentencing and cracking down on this, we're getting the courts at the magistrates level in particular clogged with stupid drug cases that do not need to be there. So
a court system which is already stressed and overloaded.
Yes, a court system which is very much stressed and overloaded. And I would be talking long beyond the hour we have set aside for that if we've got questions about that. So legalizing cannabis at first instance will have a lot of health benefits, have a lot of flow-on revenue benefits, and have a lot of public interest benefits in regards to law enforcement.
So I think it's particularly ironic, in fact, that the patient or victim in that case was arrested and sent to court for a condition that he sought medicine for.
Yeah. And
that condition meant he would have really struggled to appear in court.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, it was a hassle getting him there. I eventually, once the case was dealt with, we advised him to move to a state where you were allowed to use, we were allowed to have medical.
So that's ACT, I believe, and
South Australia.
South Australia, that's right. That's the other one.
Time, yeah.
Oh, we've known friends who've moved to South Australia recently. Wonder why.
There is, of course, medical marijuana legalization in Queensland, but it needs to go further than that. All right, we have more questions.
Is there a way to turn on subtitles?
Don't know.
We can have a look, yep. I somehow doubt it, though, as they'll have to be... Yeah.
We can put subtitles on the video after the fact, but I don't think we can do it.
Potentially.
I don't think the technology is that advanced yet. All right.
So we have a question about the Australian weapons industry.
Is that in regards to the arms exports that happened under Christopher Pyne as Defence Minister? I'm assuming that's what that means.
Potentially, it's somewhat broad. Yeah, there are a few ways we could talk about that.
Yeah.
So another thing we could talk about is the tender for submarines, which went out under Abbott and Turnbull.
Right. Okay. Well, let's start with the guns first because that's an easier, or the arms dealing, which is an easier one. That was a bad idea, and we shouldn't have done it. Selling weapons is a good way to make money very quickly, but is very bad for perpetuating conflicts around the world, which we have already been doing in other ways, and not taking the moral high ground, which Australia is failing at in regards to foreign and domestic policy quite too often in the last decade and a bit. So yeah, I'm not a fan of what we did there in regards to gun running, essentially. In regards
That's what it is.
It is what it is, yeah. In regards to submarine tenders, basically, while our defence policy, which needs a revision, I will be frank to admit, does focus heavily on the fact that a submarine defence fleet is a good idea, the submarines that have been tendered out are essentially dead-end orphan technology. They will be obsolete by the time they start rolling out.
That was the French...
Yeah.
The French bid we went with, I believe.
Yeah.
There was some concerns over whether we'd get the IP for those as well, wasn't there?
Yeah, because there was one part of the tender, as I understand it, was one part of the tender was that we'd have to service them there. We wouldn't be able to service them in Australia.
Great idea. Let's just send our entire fleet to Europe for maintenance every 6 months. Yeah. There's nothing that could go wrong with that. How about that repair, huh? It's kind of grim irony there.
Yeah.
So obviously our policy on paper, we do support a switch over towards a defense in depth, I think is the term.
Yeah.
So in that case, quality over quantity, we would in principle support the expansion of our submarine fleet as a more cost-effective way of defending Australian waters. But there's a whole separate debate there, and we're going to be examining and reconsidering that policy at this coming election as we've started having discussions in the back about whether that's the most appropriate way forward.
Yeah. Also, while we're on the topic of defence, we should know that the coalition spent $80 billion before they went into caretaker mode on obsolete military technology to basically hang a debt albatross around whoever is going to be the next government. Now, if it's the coalition again, which is looking more and more unlikely, I'm sure they'll find some way to wriggle around that. But if it is a different party, and at the moment is the bets, the different betting houses are giving good odds on the ALP, then it's looking like they'll have this $80 billion albatross, and in 3 years' time, you'll start seeing the attack ads about how they didn't do any of their promises. So
what you're saying is the Liberal National Party have spent vast amounts of money on obsolete hardware, and then they're planning to be out of office by the time people actually have to deal with it. Meanwhile, the Australians have to do that now.
They are politically poisoning the well in regards to what happens over the next 3 years from a defence spending and public policy standpoint. Okay.
So we've got a question about reforms to parliamentary culture. That's an interesting one, and the electoral process. So we do actually have a proposal for electoral system reform. It's a little bit arcane, but electoral systems are arcane. or even Byzantine. That's a cool word. Yeah, so we're looking at making some changes. For a start, one proposal we support is the concept of a citizen-initiated referendum. The idea that the Australian people can petition Parliament to launch a national referendum. And if enough of the people of Australia want to talk about an issue, then we can essentially bring that to the national attention. We no longer need to go through and petition our members and start a national campaign and social media and put all this pressure on. We can simply bypass all of that bureaucratic overhead and go straight to the people and say, here's an issue we want to talk about and we need to make a decision on. So for our electoral reform process, we support mixed member proportional for state and federal lower houses to ensure an overall accurate representation of votes. We support optional preferential voting. We propose removing thresholds. There's a few other methods as well. So we internally in the party use the Shulls-Condorcet method for vote allocation. If you want to get into the maths of it. We support Robson rotation, single transferable vote. We want to abolish nomination deposits, instead requiring nomination signatures. So that'll be familiar for anyone who's running as an independent without a party. The system currently requires nomination signatures from an electorate. As instead, if you're running with a party, you can simply, all the party members will validate that. We also want to set the number of signatures at a level reflecting the number of campaigners to interact with the electorate. So 10 nominators per candidate, as the top 10 polling places in each division serve around half the population. And we want to ease the volume of election time paperwork. So we'll increase the time that candidates can lodge nomination documents. And we've got some policies on redistricting as well to smooth that out. And we also support paper ballots. So e-voting has been a bit of a hot, not quite a hot topic, but it's popped up a few times recently. So the ACT elections last year, I believe, mid last year, actually they used e-voting, and there were some concerns about that. So several people spoke in to analyse and criticise the system, including local Brisbane resident and green sporter Tim Wilson-Brown, works for the Tor Foundation. He wrote an in-depth analysis, which you can find if you just search for his name, you'll find the article. And so he analysed several security issues and found a vulnerability in the system which allowed partial identification of voters under an e-voting system. So to do with timing, placement of the votes. So our stance is that e-voting isn't secure, and it's a risk. There's always going to be a risk when using e-voting. So obviously we support open source technologies for various reasons, but in terms of software security, network security, it's just easier to validate them when it's open and everyone can review the code. You will get members of civil society, you will get volunteers and open source coders and people who we all trust will go through that code and analyze it and make sure that it's safe and secure. And then paper ballots as a verification method for that to make sure that the e-voting system does still stay secure.
There was something I saw today on social media in regards to e-voting, and there was a study done that by an Australian academic which showed that it was unviable basically from a tampering perspective, which is why paper ballots are a better way to go. But also just outside of all the technical side of things in regards to processes and reducing the fees, which is important because that's a lockout for a large group, for a large subsection of the community who would otherwise probably make good representatives of the Australian people. But in regards to parliamentary culture, it's gotten a lot nastier over the last 10 years talking to parliamentarians we know and have interacted with, and we'd want to see that wound back. The bipartisanship particularly has gotten very nasty. In a particular vote earlier this year, or the late last year, the very stupid "it's okay to be white" vote. One of the coalition senators was late to the chamber, came in and said basically, "Well, the green senators are over there voting there, so I'm obviously going to vote opposite them." Just went to the other side of the room, didn't even read what he was voting for, so he voted in favour of this stupid motion, which was then retracted by everybody the next day when they realised what the hell they'd actually done. So that sort of accountability, the representatives have to be held accountable in regards to what they're actually doing in the chamber. And so I'd want to see more professionalism amongst our elected representatives, which we've just not been seeing over the last few years.
Yes, please. So how about that parliamentary culture? How about an environment of respect for other elected members, an environment of respect for people who maybe don't support you, didn't vote for you, but you can respect them anyway and their opinions?
We don't just represent the people who voted for. Don't just represent the people who voted for. You represent everybody in your electorate. And as Senate candidates, the entirety of Queensland would be the people we have to listen to.
That's right. So there's sort of a question there about what kind of the goal behind a representative political system is. If we elected as senators, will we be representing Queensland, or will we also have to look at the interests of all of Australia?
Well, we have to look at the interests of all of Australia, but primarily we would have to look at the interests of Queensland first, because they're the ones we account to.
We would be representing the interests of Queensland in discussions and negotiations with the representations of people in other states.
Yes.
So this is like a pretty basic low level, but there's this concept called direct democracy. And let's talk about this a little bit, because we in the party support that a lot. We've got a concept called liquid democracy, and we play with it a little bit. So what we want to do is give responsibility back to the people. As elected representatives, we wouldn't want to be making decisions for everyone. We've got a set of values and principles we stand on. We've got ideas which we think are important and that we want to talk about, and changes we want to make. But at the same time, we're not experts on everything. We're definitely experts in some things. Oh, I am.
Well, so am I. But
yeah, there you go.
And I certainly don't come from the perspective that I do know everything or I know what's best.
So,
I'm going to listen to experts. I'm going to listen to people whose opinion and whose expertise I respect, and I understand that they are leaders in their field.
Yeah. And so just on that note, Brandon has a community legal aid background. I've got a software community organizing background. Yeah. And how many of those do you see in government?
Well, in government, you see too many lawyers. I'm not going to lie.
That's true. But how many of them have a legal aid background?
Not as many as there should be. Generally speaking, they're all corporate lawyers or some stretch of that. I mean, I think there's like one environmental lawyer in the Greens. But aside from that...
So Michael Berkman, the state member for Maywa, environmental lawyer.
Yes.
I believe Larissa Waters has a legal background as well.
I believe Larissa Waters is the environmental lawyer I'm thinking of. But yeah, there's not enough community lawyers. And I've been a community lawyer, I've been a criminal defense lawyer, I've been a family lawyer, I've been a police prosecutor. I've done pretty much everything except for property law, which I'm terrible at, and personal injuries law, which... Well, when I was studying personal injuries law, they changed the law right before the exam, so I didn't bother with it. So, but yeah. So there's not a lot of generalist lawyers anywhere really, but particularly in Parliament.
So I think what we're talking about here with regards to parliamentary culture is that we want voices from more diverse backgrounds, that we want people with occupations who aren't businessman, investor, lawyer in Parliament. No, we want people who are doctors and teachers.
Doctors, teachers.
And engineers.
Tradespeople, scientists.
Yeah, scientists, thank you. Maybe even some pirates.
Psychologists, social workers.
Yeah, social workers.
Let's not just stick to the hard science and trades. Let's look at what we would call the soft sciences as well.
Yeah,
Authors, artists.
And we're engineers here talking. Well, I am. I don't know about you.
Just remember the difference between science and screwing around is writing it down. And I write down everything. File notes are king.
Yep. Got to document it.
Okay.
So we had a question there about e-voting. So we were talking about that just before. Let's quickly recap on that. So we support technology and we support technology-enabled initiatives. It's one of the key things behind the party. But the thing is, as a party understanding technology, we also like to think we understand the risks. And we want to recognize and acknowledge those risks. And there are risks with e-voting. In the recent ACT trial, there was identified weaknesses, security weaknesses in the e-voting system. Where the key one identified was a timing attack, which allowed you to identify the time of the vote placed, and in conjunction with some other actions, you could then identify the voter itself. So, like, anonymous voting is a huge key part of democracy. You want to feel that you have privacy when you vote, and you're not coerced when you vote. That's a key part of any democratic system. So if there was an e-voting system to be brought in, we want it to be open source, so that it can be reviewed and analyzed by the private sector, by the open source community, by volunteers to make sure that it's secure, civil sector representatives. And we want to run it alongside paper voting to ensure that those votes can properly be checked and ensure the system has integrity.
All right. So William from Norway has asked us another question.
That's a really interesting question.
So what are our thoughts on having data centers and server buildings having fixed amount of solar cell panels on their buildings to make them more environmentally friendly and green?
Well, how about we talk about, for a start, we are in the Sunshine State here in Queensland, which is the northeast corner of Australia. We are referred to the Sunshine State. We have one of the largest amounts of sunshine per year. And so given a state that we're powered by something like 60 to 80% black coal, I believe is the figure, well, that what's going on, guys?
And honestly, if you can put a solar cell in any sort of building, you can put it on any building, not just server buildings. The green buildings would be the way to go in regards to a lot of power generation. There are all sorts of weird little things you can do to retrofit older buildings so they can be generating power or feeding power back into the grid. One of the biggest problems in Queensland particularly is that while we can put solar cells on everything, or we can put, like in Canada, they were putting turbines in, they were putting hydro turbines basically in toilets. So every time you flush the toilet, you've got an electric charge generated, which is a great idea.
Two-powered toilets.
Damn straight. So you could do that, but the problem in Queensland in particular is that our grid can't handle power being fed back into it. So that's something that would need to be overhauled. So yeah, we want green buildings. We want all that sort of renewable technology put in because it's not being used. It needs to be experiment on, and retrofitting older buildings might be a good way to go to continue the life of that building without having to put in new ones. And overdevelopment is another problem that we're having here in Queensland, particularly in southeast Queensland along the Sunshine Coast.
And that ties to the debate about land clearing here in Queensland, which was a huge issue a few years ago. And that's a whole separate discussion we can go into. But how about we talk a bit about our energy policy first? So what we propose is a decentralized grid. So as Brandon mentioned, we would need to retool the grid here in Queensland a little bit to allow consumer input. But essentially, we want to put power production back in the hands of users. We want to put subsidies in place for home produced energy, and that's technology agnostic. So while in practice it would mostly mean solar, to support things like where you've got a big enough property, wind turbines, your local hydro gas, so ethanol powered production. If you have a lot of green waste to pass on. So we want that decentralized. We want consumers with easy access to power production technology in their homes so that they can produce their own power and eliminate power bills entirely. Forget slashing power bills. Let's get rid of power bills. Let's let people produce their own power.
And that is part of the reason why, particularly in Australia, the mining lobby is still so strong, because once we've gotten those renewable energy sources up and running, we're not going to need power companies anymore. We're going to be able to get rid of that hierarchy, which of course they're afraid of, which is why we've still got the push for clean coal and other ridiculousness like that. Though also, like in the last 2 months, the United Arab Emirates has switched on one of the largest the largest solar farm in the Northern Hemisphere. And remember, the UAE is an economy entirely based on fossil fuels. And
yeah, I was about to mention that.
They're going renewables. So
talking about the OPEC states, we're talking like one of the chief oil producers in the world for the past 50 to 80 years or however long it is.
Yeah, and the UK has just started. It was this week or last week. They've gone the first time that they've generated power without coal use.
That's a really cool milestone.
So yeah, if the UK can do it and the UAE can do it, we can do it.
So speaking of the UK, they've had a very something very interesting going on here. This is a little bit of a tangent, but the UK, some of you might be aware, has recently declared a climate emergency. So we were at a rally for that today.
Yes, we were. In regards to, it was looking at Stop Adani, but also declaring a climate emergency and basically trying to get governments to actually put in proper policies in regards to issues of climate change and environmental degradation and the problems we're going to be having in 10 to 12 years, essentially.
So in our policy, we call for an emissions reduction by 50% by 2030. This was a policy that was developed 10 years ago when the 50% target was still considered viable by the majority of climate scientists. Obviously, that situation now changed. The target, which advocates and scientists in Australia are calling for, is 100% by 2030.
Yeah.
And I think that's a reasonable target.
It is.
I think that's a desirable target.
It is achievable.
And an achievable target.
We're going to have to work for it. But the issue that a lot of people are saying is, and the fear mongering in regards to when the climate tax was initially brought in by the Rudd government nearly 10 years ago. The part of the fear campaign that was that it would cost regular people. No, it's not going to cost us. The primary polluters. We know who the primary polluters are in the world. There's about 90 of them. They're CEOs of different companies. We can fit them on 3 Greyhound buses. We know who they are.
Ooh.
They're the people.
What do we do with those buses, though?
We make them pay. We make them pay. Polluter pays principles. That's what we're looking at. But it's not going to go. We're not going to go after regular people in regards to paying a climate tax. That any sort of renewable or emissions reduction scheme is certainly going to only be going after the high end of town, the polluters. Yes, there are things that we can do, but we're looking at corporate, heavy industrial polluters more than just the regular citizens of Australia.
So we want to get in a carbon tax. Basically, that's our proposal. But the argument that taxing carbon, taxing coal power, and since something like 60 to 80, around 85% of our power nationally comes from fossil fuels, the argument that taxing that would increase power bills, well, not necessarily, because where would that money from the tax go? It would go straight back to renewable subsidies. So we'd be setting up alternative sources of power, which would keep prices down by increasing supply. So no, energy bills absolutely don't have to increase from that tax.
Okay, so Williams here just sent in a comment about greenways, which is something we were discussing earlier again as well. In New South Wales in particular, back in the 60s and 70s, I think it was, the various construction unions were mandating that the green areas be preserved, or green throughways be preserved in urban planning. So there were parks, there were these sort of things, and that went out of style, went out of fashion for some reason. That's something that needs to be brought back. But I mean, I'm fairly lucky where I live. There's a lot of nature reserves around me, so I've been fairly lucky in that regard. The local council has done good things there. Got a question here from Kia. What will we be doing about domestic violence and change?
That's one for you.
That's one for me, yeah. And changing the courts, etc., regarding that. Fortunately, the domestic violence laws in Australia have been improved quite significantly over the last few years. We've got the National Domestic Violence Register. That means that if you get a domestic violence order in any state or territory in Australia, it is transferable to another state or territory, you have to move, and is enforceable in that regard. In regards to courts dealing with domestic violence matters, part of the problem I've seen, both as a prosecutor and as a defence lawyer, is just education. People applying for domestic violence orders where there are alternatives in regards to what can be done. For example, if there is a contentious matter in the family court can deal with that. It doesn't have to go through a domestic violence stream. Now, there is part of the problem is that there are massive backlogs in the family court. And that means people will try to get action quicker, so they'll try through the domestic violence stream, which is slightly faster. That's not the best way to do it. That's going to cause more problems. It's also a type of forum shopping. So the domestic violence laws as they stand could do with some improvement, particularly in regards to enforcement of orders and protections. But while there may be some complaints about the courts, it's the support networks around the courts. So social work, community support, financial support, safe housing and shelters for victims of domestic violence, protections for children through the various departments that already exist. All these things have to be bolstered and improved and have not money just thrown at them, but the right people and the right rules put into place, and also policy that actually interfaces properly with legislation. One of the biggest complaints I have is that a certain government department will have policy that contradicts the legislation, and that leads to all sorts of problems. In regards to the family court, again, throwing money at it's not going to work, but I do not believe that amalgamating the federal and family courts will work. You need those two separate bodies. More judges would be great. When I was practicing family law 2 years ago, we were down 3 judges in Brisbane. It's probably gotten worse since then. Also, the caseload for family court judges, I believe, was about 600, and judges
per judge.
And
what time period is that over?
That's like you're allowed to have 600 cases in 12 months, and we were hitting that number in April. So there's a lot of cases out there. So we need support. We need mediation. You don't have to go to family court. Generally speaking, if you go into court, you've screwed up. You don't want to go to court. You want to try and mediate this out. So we need more trained mediators. We need more people to write family reports. But we also do need a certain amount of judges being able to handle these things. And we also need to take some of the family court jurisdiction back to the magistrates' courts so that they can deal with some of the stuff like recovery orders. If there is a parenting order in place and someone takes a child, then back in the day when I first started practicing, we could go to a magistrates' court, get that recovery order, and get it, and we could have the child back with the parent supposed to be with in just over 24 hours. Now, getting an urgent recovery order can take up to 6 weeks. So time is a factor, and spreading that around so we reduce the backlog would certainly help with that.
So let's jump back to Queensland here again for a bit. And let me just bring it up. There was a post released by the Australian Council of Trade Unions recently, putting out their recommendations for who to vote for. Let's bring it up and see if we can see what it says.
We're pro-union, by the way.
Oh, very pro-union. We marched on Labor Day. I'm a workplace delegate, with a bit of luck soon, a conference delegate for Together Union. Thank you.
One of the smartest men I knew who taught me a lot about the world was, and taught me particularly about the union movement, was a foreman down at the Brisbane waterfront back in the day. So I'm very much pro-union. Not to say unions are perfect, of course, but we need them.
Yeah, no, there are definitely problems in the unions movement.
Yeah, well, if you're an organisation set up to deal with a problem, unfortunately, sometimes it is in your organisation's best interest to see some of those problems perpetuated. So you need regulation on unions, but generally speaking, you need unions more than you don't. Unions gave you a lot of the free workplace freedoms you already have. So what are you looking for here?
I'm trying to find the post I was looking at.
Is this in regards to their preferencing?
Yeah.
The kerfuffle in North
Yeah.
Queensland, and the kerfuffle around who their preference first and who they think is the best of the bad bunch.
So this kind of ties into a broader debate about what.
Here it is. This is the one I've seen too. Yeah.
So change the rules. Change the rules campaign, which all unions around Australia have jumped in to participate in. A huge campaign. And we've seen a huge response from union activists here in Queensland, here in Brisbane. There's been a lot of volunteers out flyering before and during the election as well for the Change the Rules campaign. We want to change the rules in the workplace around fair pay and fair treatment to ensure that workers get what they need and what they're deserved. However, the recommendations here, which I might post in chat. I'll see if I can get in there. The Australian Council of Trade Unions, the peak union body representing all unions, recommends number 1, Australian Labor Party. Number 2, Katter's Australia Party.
Mad Catter's Tea Party.
Number 3, the Democratic Labor Party.
Not a fan of them.
Number 4, the Greens.
Fans of them.
Number 5, an Independent. Number 6, United Australia Party. Number 7, Liberal National Party. Number 8, Pauline Hanson's One Nation. Number 9, Fraser and a Conservative Party.
Yeah. This was in the electorate of, this is the lower house seat of Capricornia. It was, and I believe, and when the Council of Trade Unions was challenged on their choices, their response was not great.
The response was, we've got to put Labor first above everything. We can't have real transformative change in government. No, we've got to get Labor in. Got to get Labor in.
If that was actually their response, I would have been mildly satisfied with that. But they basically went, you sort out. Essentially, their response was, you sort out this rubbish, or words to that effect. So, didn't do them any favors.
Yeah, so we support the union movement. I am a union organizer, and I run union campaigns. But what we're seeing here is that the higher you go up in the union movement, and in some cases right up to the top, they're pushing ALP politics. They're pushing a party which has, in some cases, shown they're not in favour of meaningful reform, that in some cases are even compromising on workers' rights and positions for workers, that however much support and funding the ALP might receive from unions, the ALP is not an arm of the unions. They're not acting on the union platform. It's just taken for guaranteed that unionists will support the Labor Party in Labor's endless quest to try and beat out Liberal Nationals. Where's the policy here? Where's the stances? Where's the real, meaningful vision behind the Labor Party?
Well, it hasn't been true for some time in the Labor Party, in my experience. So, which is why we've... Yeah.
Maybe the alternative is something different, something new, something radical, something different.
I am hoping, and I know I won't get it, but, we all wish really hard and vote really hard on Saturday. I'm hoping for a minority government with a very strong crossbench of independents and alternative parties.
I think that's the best result we can hope for.
Yeah, come this election.
Because there is going to be a big swing Labor. And in a lot of seats, we're seeing a big swing Green as well.
Well, we should probably take a moment of silence, because I've just been handed this note that Bob Hawke has passed away today. So we're talking about unions. We have to mention that his contribution to the union movement was spectacular, and his contribution to Australian politics was spectacular. Despite what we might disagree with him on some, policy elements, but his contribution cannot be understated. And basically, the old man of the Labor Party is gone, and that's a tragic loss. So, yes, after this, we will take a moment of silence, and then we'll down a yard glass.
Then a roadie fuckers.
But yes, we support free association. If you support free association, then you support the union movement. Okay. And we've got a question here.
We've got a very good question here about the process of transitioning for trans people and also non-binary people in that process. So I'm just bringing up our policy now. We'll put it. Actually, it's a position statement.
That's right.
As our policy in several references trans and LGBTIQ issues, as it covers a wide spectrum of society. So not only is there human rights issues at stake, there's also obviously medical issues, issues with free speech and safety, mental health,
Mm.
and so on, physical health, so on and so forth. So we're just bringing up the statement now.
Mm.
As a general rule, the libertarian position is that you should have the right to identify how you like, to dress how you like, and with reasonable limits to speak how you like as well. So we absolutely support that, and we support protections for that. So hence our stance on 18C, which is nuanced, very nuanced. We don't want to just get rid of it entirely. We oppose censorship, absolutely 100%. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that there are protections in place, reasonable protections.
Yeah. And we have a fairly good relationship with Gender Agenda in Canberra, and they have been quite happy with our policies on this area, but of course there is always room for improvement. The platform here, I think, is really in regards to control of the body under our policies.
No, I've got it here.
We've actually got a position statement on gender divergence as well, and intersex conditions.
Would you like to take that one?
Sure.
So there's a bit of a read there.
Yeah. So forgive me, it's going to take a moment. So this was our position statement back in 2016.
And our policies predate that, but this one just unified it together.
Yeah. The issues affecting transgender and intersex persons cover a narrow swath across a large number of Pirate Party Australia policy areas. These issues are frequent sources of public inquiry. The policy statement outlines the concerns, followed by a cross-reference to the related inclusions in other policy statements. The diversity of and within gender is still little understood and accepted in wider society, which can cause all sorts of problems. Social, bureaucratic, and possible medical challenges of transitioning from the gender one is assigned to at birth to the gender one identifies with are exacerbated by prejudice and discrimination at most levels of society, even family and close friends. As a consequence, the issues transgender people face are much like those that the gay population were and still are facing: being beaten, thrown out of home, losing work, and many other issues. The prevalence of male to female transsexualism is estimated to be in the range of 1 to 250 to 1 to 200 in the general population. Being transgender isn't just a case of feeling attracted to what society deems the wrong gender. It is people assuming from your birth that you are something other than you. Some people feel for a long time something isn't right, but I don't know what. And some people go along the lines of, I wish I was a girl, boy, different gender. Then finding out either sooner or later it is possible. Trying to differ from what society has deemed your gender at birth to be causes momentous challenges for people in such situations. One of the first questions asked when a baby is born is whether it's a boy or girl. One or two answers is usually given based on physical appearance.
Closing the answer, which is in 8 minutes. So it's a good time to start packing up and making your way towards the exits. Don't forget your personal belongings and you can toss the rubbish before you leave.
How about we?
Tomorrow. Just 8 minutes.
How about we?
We'll
skip the preamble. Move ahead to the policy statements.
All
so
right.
we support constitutional recognition of the equality of gender and sex diverse people. We abolish patents on pharmaceutical drugs, which will reduce the cost of perpetually overpriced drugs that may be a lifelong requirement for transgender people. We want to implement fair and respectful processing of asylum seekers fleeing oppression for their gender, sex, or orientation. We want to reform the prison system to include diverse, gender-appropriate prison assignment and hormone replacement therapy continuation while in jail. We want to remove legal definitions of marriage and recognize it as a civil union of any two peoples. We want to improve the treatment of transgender persons in the public health system. We want to endorse and extend the Safe Schools program. We want to simplify the process of changing gender in official identification documents. So we've linked the position statement there in chat for anyone who wants the full text.
Yeah. Also, I should point out we've since changed, removed legal definitions of marriage and recognised civil union of any two persons. We've removed any person. We've removed the number 2. I think it's any persons now. So Pirate Party supports polyamory.
There you go. Go forth and be free. So we'll probably be wrapping up shortly.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to offer a couple of quick statements on recent legislation which went forward, which we offered submissions to government for and we took public stances on. So obviously we've spoken about Assange already previously. The current situation of Assange is in the UK court systems fighting extradition to the US and Sweden.
Sweden now, yeah.
Simultaneously, he has been evicted from the Ecuadorian asylum, and there's been radio silence from Australia, the Australian government on the matter. And we, along with many other civil society groups in Australia, are calling for the government to take a stand and support Assange. Additionally, there was a reform to the Copyright Act brought in at the end of last year. This was this one swam right through, and no one talked about it. Everyone missed it except for the usual suite of civil society advocates such as ourselves and others who've been talking about this for years. The change was, of course, to bring in warrantless site blocking. It's an extrajudicial process which would allow companies to grab a URL, send it to ISPs and say, hey, you guys need to block this, and then they can get that backed up by a court order if the go straight to a court to get a court order if the ISP refuses. So hey, let's hand over website blocking and censorship powers straight to American companies and European companies and Australian companies.
And this happened, and this has been implemented just after the horrible events in Christchurch recently. A whole bunch of sites were blocked without warrant, without notice, just went straight through.
Absolutely.
When Chris Conroy was communications minister under the last Labor government, Stephen Conroy, sorry, why did I say Chris? Stephen Conroy, under the last Labor government, he put through the idea of the website blacklist, which
the Great Australian Firewall.
The Great Australian Firewall. We fought that strenuously, not because of what was going to happen then, but what would happen 10 years, 20 years down the track.
Which is now 10 years down the track, and we are seeing it happening. It is happening around us.
Yeah.
So that was actually one of the founding issues of the Pirate Party in Australia.
Yeah.
One of the issues which really catalyzed our founding members and our founding supporter base back then. Now let's quickly race on. The final other issue I wanted to talk about was a very scary bill which just popped through just before Christmas, and it was deliberately rushed through just before Christmas. We are, of course, talking about the Arse Access Bill, the Assistance and Access Bill, the hashtag AA Bill on Twitter and Facebook.
Which the Labor opposition just rubber stamped.
What were their amendments? Oh, they had some. They watered down some provisions and slightly stricter than others. And it's like, hey, we're the moderate centrist party. The Australian Labor Party once again proves they are the lesser of two evils while still being evil. Yeah. And when Christmas came around and all those politicians didn't want to miss out on their lovely however many 4 months of Christmas they get or 3 months of Christmas break they get, they didn't want to miss that. So the Labor Party dropped their amendments and joined the LNP in bringing in the Assistance and Access Bill, a bill which can allow the federal police or government agencies to compel software developers and IT companies to introduce security vulnerabilities into their systems, to make their systems deliberately weaker, to invalidate security on their systems, to make it easy for hackers and state actors and illegitimate users to access private personal data of users and consumers, Australian citizens or otherwise, and then put a gag order on any developers or any people working on that software. So this is a bill which has huge ramifications going forward. We've already seen multiple companies who have begun divesting Australia of their hosting services and their employees as well, because Australian citizens can be compelled by the government with a gag order to introduce vulnerabilities into IT systems,
which just makes it untenable from a business or practical standpoint,
including overseas IT systems. So if you're an Australian IT professional and you want to go work in Hong Kong or San Francisco or Berlin, guess what? You are now a security vulnerability because you're an Australian. You are now a security vulnerability.
We're getting the wind up.
Well, it's been great talking to you guys. Thanks a lot for joining us tonight.
Thank you kindly for your questions, and please vote below the line on Saturday.
Remember to vote Pirate on Saturday.
All right. Thank you kindly. Good night.
See you on the internet.